Hi, everybody. Welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, December 1st. And we're very, very happy to see you today. My name is Heather Kraus, and I am the founder of an organization called We All Count. And the focus of We All Count is on embedding equity into all the projects that we do with data. And one of the things that We All Count does is we host this gathering, an informal gathering on Fridays of anybody who is interested in data and interested in equity and trying to figure out practical, real world ways to combine those two things. So welcome to Talking Data Equity. I know many of you come often, and I'm loving getting to know the community. And some of you will be here for the first time. So I'm going to give a really short overview of kind of the housekeeping of Talking Data Equity, and then we'll get into the conversation. So the housekeeping of data equity is that we run this as a Zoom meeting, even though we often have many people. And so that requires a little bit of mutual care. So in general, it's up to you whether you'd like to have your video on or off. And we would in general like you to have your microphone off. Unless you are specifically asking or answering a question, just because even the slightest bit of background noise when amplified by 200 people gets distracting. So what we're going to do today is we have a special guest. And so I'm going to do a really brief introduction to our special guest. And then she's going to talk for a little bit. And then we're going to pivot to a conversation. And in that conversation, you can ask questions by unmuting yourselves. You can also ask questions using the chat function. And if you want to use the chat function, you can ask questions that are addressed to everybody. Or if you want, you can direct message a question to me, Heather Kraus, and I'm happy to amplify a question if you prefer to remain anonymous. And last but not least, we are recording this. We record all of our Talking Data Equity sessions, and we share them in the publicly accessible We All Count Data Equity Community Forum. I just put a link to that forum into the chat. And if you ever have to miss a Talking Data Equity session, that's where to look for it. Or if you want to share, if this one is amazing and you want to share it with all your friends, that's how you share it. All right. So that's the housekeeping. We're really excited to get going because today we have a special guest with experience that many of you have been writing in and requesting. We're very happy to welcome Amanda Heidt. And Amanda is a journalist and an editor. And so that's a very special and important set of skills in today's world. Really high value. And we're really grateful, Amanda, that you are willing to take some of your time and share it with us today. Amanda is a freelance journalist and editor with over 4 years of experience tackling stories across life and earth sciences. And these stories touch on everything from ecology and archaeology to the nittiest grittiest molecular biology and the farthest reaches of space. When she finds research beautiful and compelling, she was previously a scientist herself. Amanda is also invested in sharing the complex experiences of scientists themselves and enjoys covering issues related to DEI in academia and DEI in science and science history. You can find her work in really prestigious places like Nature, like Science, like The Scientist, like National Geographic, like NPR, and other places. So we are really excited that Amanda, you had time to join us today. And some of the work that Amanda has done is behind a paywall. And so I did get some special permission just for today to be able to share a few links with you, which I'm going to share in the chat right now. So you can see some some unpaywalled versions in case you don't have like a subscription or access to those. I don't want you to feel like you can't read any of Amanda's work. So there you go. There's some links. And let me welcome Amanda. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being willing to share some of your valuable time with us. And what is your experience with trying to find data on these topics and thinking about how equity and data in journalism are intersecting on the topics that you cover?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Hello, everybody. Greetings from Moab, Utah, where I was just telling Heather it is snowing outside for the first time. So that's why it's so dark in my house. But yeah, happy to chat about it. So, I thought maybe before I jump into that question, I could just tell a little bit more about my background. So, I was previously, as I said, as a scientist, and so I have a graduate degree in marine science. I used to live in the Bay Area in Santa Cruz, where I did my bachelor's and my master's degree, and then went on to basically, I got an internship at KQED in San Francisco, which is their NPR station, and I wanted a scholarship to fund my science, and didn't really think about the internship side, and then ended up really kind of falling in love with science journalism, and was surprised that I never really thought about it before. And so I ended up going through the science communication master's program at UC Santa Cruz. And I graduated in 2020. So that was kind of how that's gone. And one thing that I've really enjoyed about journalism is kind of the capacity and ability to really engage with a lot of different fields in science. And that's not how every journalist does it. Some people really focus in on one particular place, but that was never quite, my forte. And increasingly, I've really been kind of drawn to these stories of not, here is some interesting science that's come out, which is, of course, still fun to do. But, these are the scientists who are doing science. And specifically, these are scientists who are here doing innovative and creative work who have potentially not been kind of recognized in the same way, in terms of what we think of when we think of a scientist. And so, I started getting into these, they're called career stories, right? So, what does it mean to be a scientist in academia, and what is academia as a profession? And so pretty quickly, what you run into is that there is not a lot of data on specific groups within academia, right? So minority groups within science, people who have a different gender identity or sexual orientation, women in science, parents, mothers in science. I get that one a lot. And so what you end up with is a heap of lived experience that very much tells you something is a problem versus a lack or a paucity of data that keeps funding agencies such as the NIH or the NSF from kind of making moves to address these issues. And so it's really kind of made me think a lot about what we define as expertise, or what we think of as data, right? Like, data to me suggests numbers, and yet a lot of times the only numbers we have are the kind of overwhelming numbers of people who are saying that something is happening. And so, when Heather first reached out to me, it was about a story I had written for Nature about diversity statements being pulled from campuses in the wake of the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, right? And so what does it mean to kind of make a statement as an institution that you're not going to promote diversity, right? They started pulling diversity departments, diversity jobs. And that is kind of an example of this, right? We have a lot of lived experience that diversity in STEM is important and does not get acknowledged, and that innovation is more likely when you have diverse groups. And yet we're kind of pulling back as a country from fostering this diversity. And I'm happy to kind of go more into any of that.
Thank you so much for, again, being willing to be here and being willing to share that. And I think that having your point of view is so valuable to help us kind of think together about how we can bridge that gap between what lived experience is saying to us very loudly and what data is being collected. And I use data in quotes, and what evidence is being generated. And I know that you've done a lot of work on kind of groups of scientists. One of your articles that's so fascinating is about the problems with scientists who do manage to get things published getting cited or getting recognized or any of that? And um, how did you discover that that was a problem? And then once you discover that's a problem, where do you look for data?
Yes. So yeah, so the paper that you're talking about is the first one of those docs. So basically, there was a big study that came out that was highlighting racial inequalities in publication rates, and so specifically, it was looking at I believe it was the number, it was citations, the editorial board composition at journals. So, a journal has a board that kind of oversees the content. And so like, what is the racial and gender and ethnic makeup of that group? And then also cite how long it takes your paper to get published once it's kind of like through the process. And so basically what they found is that, editorial boards are by and large composed of white men. And they found that, members of minority groups are kind of cited less frequently than, again, mostly white men is kind of the benchmark. And then also that once you put a paper in, your paper takes a lot longer to go through the peer review process, right? And that has a lot of kind of indirect impacts on the publishing process in terms of the amount of time that you're taking up doing these things. Citations start as soon as the paper publishes, so you're missing out on kind of readership and citations. And you know what, that story came about by social media, which is actually how a lot of my stories come together. And I kind of hate that that's true because I don't necessarily want to sink any more of my time into social media. But, I've since kind of moved over to Blue Sky, and I'm in the process of kind of building my following back up. But when I was on Twitter, I didn't find it to be quite the hellscape that I know it can be, because I was very intentional about curating like who I was following. And it tended to be other people in my professional network and scientists doing cool work. And so I came across that story because one of the co-authors had mentioned it. And it was just like a really interesting story to dig into, because one thing that I learned from it is that increasingly we're in the era of big data, right? Which means that we're using things like machine learning or AI to kind of scrape data to get at some of these really big questions. But I hear this a lot kind of in the context of modeling, right? But like, all models are just a hypothesis, right? And like, they're kind of subject to the inherent biases that the people who create them have. And so one thing that came up in this piece that I thought was so interesting was algorithms that scrape either gender or racial information or ethnic information based off of names is like a wild space. And so, for example, there was some stat that I think is in the story where, it's the majority of the time is misidentifying Black names, right? And like, you do these studies and they're obviously very important and needed, but like, what qualifiers do you need to put around the tools that you're using to really kind of bolster your findings? And the way that they got around it in this study is they kind of use complementary methods coming at this question from different directions to say like, okay, so yes, our ethnicity and race and gender scraping algorithm said X, and that's confirmed by this smaller subset that we did, in which we did everything by hand, like a person did it. And so I've really been like thinking a lot about that since I wrote this piece, because I tend to touch so much on these stories that are looking at kind of questions of representation in STEM, like what are the qualifiers that I need to be mindful of when I'm reporting on these tools. But yeah, that one was just, I got lucky on social media. That was also the same case with the diversity statement piece. A graduate student at a university posted about how, it was Georgia, was like, oh, my university just quietly rescinded diversity statements from its hiring practices. Like, wouldn't it be a shame if everybody heard about this? Wink, wink, nod, nod. And I was kind of like, hello. And that's how that story came to be. And I was like, if it's happening in Georgia, it must be happening, elsewhere. And that was the story, right? Like, how do you go out and find these things? And, you were asking like, what was the question about data? Like, how do I go about finding people?
Well, before we go further, because I think this is going to be really, really important for the conversation. Can you give the people who haven't read that diversity statement article just a quick summary of like what a diversity statement is and what your investigation uncovered?
Yeah, absolutely. So diversity statements are basically one of a portfolio of documents that are often solicited in the hiring process. They're almost never mandatory, right? These are just documents that you're able to put in support of your application. And they basically give you a space to talk about how your own diverse kind of life experience will factor into your teaching and your mentoring, and how you intend to implement diversity, equity, inclusion in your teaching, right? So, providing mentorship, different mentorship opportunities for students, using gender neutral language, things like that. And they've been around since the early 2000s, I would say, mostly. And, we're never really, like, seemingly not a huge thing, but in the wake of the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, which basically banned race-conscious admissions in undergraduate admissions, a lot of universities started seemingly getting a little bit spooked, right? And they started kind of pulling diversity statements out of their hiring practices. And that was in conjunction with a lot of other things. As I mentioned, they started shutting down diversity departments, like groups of people who work at a university who are focusing on recruiting diverse talent, basically. And they started, basically just tamping down on all of these things. And the reason is because seemingly they fear lawsuits, right? Like, what happens if a student files a complaint saying that they feel discriminated against? And so it was seemingly from a reactive place of fear. That's kind of what I found. But the interesting thing is that the Supreme Court decision didn't say anything about any of this, right? It basically just said, in this very narrow context, which is undergraduate admissions, not even graduate admissions, you cannot consider race or ethnicity in your practices of kind of how you evaluate people. And so that's what made it interesting to me, is, right, like, this is kind of this overreaction on the part of university administrators that could conceivably have really damaging effects. And so as part of that story, I spoke to somebody very high up at, what was it? I want to say NAGPRA, because I'm working on a story about NAGPRA, at the Negro College Fund, who was saying, like, I feel like we've really taken a step back, right? Like, and a consequence of this is, he was saying, I think we're going to see more students applying to historically Black colleges and universities, which on its face is good, right? Like, I have talked to many people who either have gone to or work for HBCUs, and they sound like wonderful and supportive places. But the idea is that 90% of Black students go to non-HBCUs, right? And so there's just not capacity. They're chronically underfunded to absorb all these students. And so you end up placing people in positions where they're kind of entering a hostile environment for years. HBCU is a historically Black college or university. So these are schools where they're not just for Black students, but are primarily kind of populated by Black students. And, students have kind of shared with me that they've had really kind of supportive environments there. And I think about my own graduate experience, I actually feel like I got pretty lucky, but, there are certainly friends of mine who had a rough go of things for 4 years. But yeah, so that was a really interesting story.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really interesting story. And the initial decision, the initial ruling about how you can and cannot use data for undergraduate admissions was, acknowledged to be quite important. And then what I really liked about your story was you were like, yes, that is a very important thing. And here's all the ways it's having these ripple effects. Not just the effect that we immediately understood, but all of these ripple effects. And one of the things that is important to kind of data practitioners that I think you are going to have a really useful insight into is, first of all, how did you get anyone to talk to you? Because the vast majority of people don't want to talk about this.
Yeah. And I actually think, again, like, by kind of cultivating a very intentional, like, social media presence, and kind of putting myself out there as, like, I am a reporter writing for these outlets who is interested in this, and, like, let's talk about it. So, I mean, I think about, I do, how do I want to say this? So like I live right next to the Navajo Nation, right, which is the largest Native American reservation in the country. And so I do a lot of work with kind of Navajo and Diné scientists. And one thing that comes up a lot that I think is relevant to this question about diversity is you have to get a little bit more comfy with your sources than you might in a standard news story, right? And that's not as a way of kind of circumventing the editorially independent process, which is how I think editors can sometimes see it, but it's kind of relationship and trust building with groups who have no reason, right, to tell me their very like painful and personal stories, right? But you know, a lot of times that means granting anonymity. Sometimes you know, it means maybe giving the sources just a tiny bit more oversight over how the story is going to be structured. You know, it means being more, not to say that I'm not an empathetic reporter, you know, always, but like being really kind of empathetic and almost like taking on the role of kind of a counselor, you know, like, you know, kind of helping walk people through what makes them feel comfortable. And so I think that has kind of, it's been a lot of work on my part, also a lot of educating on my part, right? Like you want to come into these conversations with people showing that you've done your homework and they're not going to have to spend all their emotional energy kind of updating you on what's happening. And then to some extent, I think, you know, eventually you just kind of get a reputation. You know, for example, like I've been doing a lot of reporting around like weird relationships between researchers and institutions and kind of like allocating space for them. And so I just like get these like they're literally Jane Doe emails, like people make burner emails and start like sending me these things. You know, for example, like a woman sent me her kind of story of like sexual harassment, you know, and I and was like, do you want to run with this, you know? And so I think you kind of eventually just get a bit of a reputation, which comes from a lot of work. You know, I hope that people feel that it's earned. But as far as like government, you know, like other entities, I mean, anyone who's being funded by taxpayer dollars is required to interface with me as the media. And you know, I was talking about this with my partner the other day. I'm not quite sure how other people's experience of this goes. I feel like by and large, people are fairly willing to chat. You know, I've done some kind of database stories with the NSF, the National Science Foundation, and the NIH, and like they've been surprisingly forthcoming in a way that surprised me also. But you know, I think if you come earnestly and like with an open mind, you know, it's the same as any other conversation. Like people will be willing to talk to you about it.
Well, you know, that is really good to hear because that has not always been my experience with even some of the organizations that you name. But I think you've said so many things there that are interesting to me because and I'm trying to figure out which one I think we should follow up on, because one of the really important things you said there was sometimes in the journalism that you do, you kind of get more comfortable with sources than is kind of considered editorially ideal. And that's really almost exactly what we as data practitioners are dealing with. Like there's this whole kind of professionalization of data analysis that if, you know, if you as a human researcher have goals other than looking for the objective number, or you get to know the people that you're collecting data from, or even share information about, you know, how you came to get to the research hypothesis that you're testing, then your science is ruined because it's no longer objective. And that's exactly what we're trying to break through. And it sounded to me like you were working on breaking through the same thing from a journalism perspective, that, you know, like having trust with the people that you're either collecting data from for a research project or collecting experience from for a journalism project doesn't mean that you're no longer doing professional work.
Yeah, and I feel like it's kind of hard for me to weigh in on like the longevity of this phenomenon because like I said, I became a journalist like full time in 2020, right? Which is like the most insane time to come into science journalism. But you know, I've been having conversations like this recently because I'm part of an inaugural cohort of there's this funding group that I'm working with, which basically pairs science journalists with disability advocates. And we are working together to kind of, again, like elevate what we define as expertise and like write these stories. And so I'm working with a disability advocate who has autism and schizophrenia, right? And we're talking about like, how do you approach educating young people differently? You know, like how do you support, you know, your children or your cousins or nephews or whatever it is, you know, who have disabilities. And we've been talking a lot about this question of like, how do you kind of approach this, you know, ethically, but also like objectively? And for what it's worth, I mean, without getting myself into too much trouble, I think objectivity is somewhat of a myth. You know, I think we should certainly like uphold rigorous editorial standards, and we should, you know, not be kind of siding in our stories, but like, you know, in order to kind of get people to open up, like you have to be willing to open up, you know. And I actually think this is also something that like these funding agencies are recognizing. You know, I think like I get the sense that they're really like interested in engaging with DEI, but they're like not very educated. So for like example, the piece about I wrote a piece which I think is one of the ones you've linked here, where the NSF is piloting adding gender identity and sexual orientation questions to their graduate survey, but like they were putting gender identity, or sorry, they were putting you know, like sexual identity like options under gender, and like it seemed clear to me that they didn't quite like have an understanding of like, they weren't kind of up on the standard practice. But yeah, you know, I think it's an evolving space. Everybody's maybe not trying their best, but they are trying. But yeah, I think getting back to your question of like, how do we, those are safe words here. Good. I'm glad. You know, getting back to this question of like, how do we maintain objectivity, right? Like, I think you draw your lines in the sand and you're clear about them, and they're not going to be the lines in the sand that would have been drawn 10 years ago. They're going to be a little bit further forward, right? And you know, I think it's just a dialogue, right? Like you don't have a conversation at the beginning and then just plow ahead, right? Like you have to kind of have these interim stopgap steps where like everyone's on board, right? And I mean, a thing I run into quite frequently is that like not everybody's always on board, but in that case, you just have to be able to kind of justify your thinking, you know, and invite feedback. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is really parallel to what we're experiencing as data professionals, that somehow there's this false idea that objectivity and rigor are the same thing. And that if you lose objectivity, you lose rigor. When I think from both a journalism perspective in listening to you, and I know for sure from direct experience from a like a data analysis perspective, they are not the same thing. And it's more about like what you're saying, transparency, being able to say what you did and why, and being able to back that up, rather than pretending that it's just the view from nowhere, that somehow we have this view from nowhere. I want to back up a little and ask a slightly different, but of course still related question. When you were talking about having the conversation with the folks that were working on the big data, the machine learning, and I think it was something like 65% of the people who self-identified as Black were getting misidentified by this machine, which I was shocked. I mean, I would have said it was high, but when I saw that number at 65%, I was like, oh, wow,
Majority. Yeah.
that's really high. As a science communicator, so as a trained science communicator, what's your approach of trying to take something complicated, like, you know, we feel really certain that this is true, or we feel moderately certain that this is true, and we still want to share it with you? I know that's something that a lot of us here in Talking Data Equity struggle with. We want to be transparent and say, you know, we've collected this data, we've done our best, and we're, you know, fairly sure that this number reflects reality, but we're not 100% sure. And so how do you approach that? And do you have any suggestions for non-professional communicators like me or the other people here?
I think hedge and qualify and fact check. I mean, I don't think it's any particular person or group's fault that like we're working with an imperfect product, right? Like I've been increasingly doing a lot of writing about AI and diversity, right? And so like, for example, like AI tends to, this is an interesting one, and I'm working on a few stories about this right now, but like AI has the potential to be a great equalizer, right? Like it can help English as a second language speakers kind of do some sort of outlining and drafting and things like that. But on the other hand, it also tends to like flatten everyone's language to sound like the majority of written material on the internet, which is again written by white men. So like it really like can be very good and very bad. And so that's kind of how I get around it, right? Like anything that I'm saying, I have to kind of both sides it in a way. So for example, you know, the first story I ever did for Nature was a write-up of a survey about whether educators were worried about AI and like if they were seeing it show up in their classrooms. And, you know, it feels like a lifetime ago, but like a year ago when AI felt very new, crazily. You know, and I think that's what this is what I did. I was like, you know, it has the capacity to do this well, and it has the capacity to do this really not well. And so that's what I would encourage people to do. Like, I think it can feel vulnerable to be like, here is a product or a data set or whatever have you that I've made. And these are its limitations, right? But that's very much a part of the scientific process, right? Any scientific paper you read is going to have a section on limitations. And I think, again, like transparency is how you kind of, you know, hedge your bets. I think just be upfront about what you can't say. And that's like 90% of the editing process is like, can we say this? You know, do we need to like hedge this language? And, you know, when I was editing, that was definitely something that I was kind of looking at too.
Have you had success with, because I've had a little bit of experience with, you know, working in the journalism sector, not as much as you, and mine is much before yours. So I'm wondering, like at the time when I was working with journalists, and still occasionally when I'm working with journalists these days, I will hear that, well, we don't want to talk about uncertainty because then people are going to think that our science is bad or that we don't know what we're doing. Do you think that that's been improved? Is your
Yes,
experience current?
yes and no, because, you know, for example, I think the pandemic has really done a service in kind of educating the public about how science is done. And, you know, we can talk about how the pandemic and the like climate has also really like done a lot of damage to science journalism, as you know, the tons and tons of layoffs will show you. But I do think like what you're talking about is basically just a lack of scientific literacy on the part of readers, right? Like they take science as gospel, and like any scientist or any educated person who's looked into it knows that that's not true. And like it should, you know, my job is literally always to be critical of anything anyone says. There's like a funny journalismism that's like, if your mother tells you she loves you, like back it up, or like, you know, like fact check it. You know, and so yeah, I think people are perhaps a bit more mindful of how science is done and a bit more willing to accept, you know, uncertainty. But at the same time, we've seen how like uncertainty in communication or messaging has really been damaging. But I mean, like, I hope it feels better. Again, you know, like I'm somewhat new to the game, so it's hard for me to look at the longevity of those types of questions.
Oh, that's really good to hear. I'm feeling increasingly optimistic as we hear from you. And I think the fact that you're a professionally trained science communicator that's new to the journalism game makes you really well positioned to kind of notice and think through these things. Oh, somebody's recommending a book, which I've
Oh yeah,
actually never heard of, but you've heard of
I
this
have.
book?
It's good. Yeah, it's good.
Oh, great.
Um,
I love hearing about books that I haven't read yet. So Science Fictions by Stuart Ritchie, going on the book list for reading over my December break. And thank you very much. Speaking of people sharing resources in the chat, I've been getting to ask a lot of the questions that I'm curious about. There's a lot of you here in the room. Does anybody want to turn their mics on and ask a question of Amanda, ask for advice from Amanda, share an experience or a resource that you've had on these topics? If you do want to come off, turn your mic on, you can do a couple of things. You can raise your hand, which usually, depending on your setup in Zoom, usually the raise your hand icon comes from reactions, which is usually a little smiley face with a plus on its head. And then it says raise your hand. But if that doesn't work for you, just put it into the chat. If that doesn't work for you, just unmute yourself and ask a question. So any of you in the room want to ask a question on communicating science, trying to figure out how to communicate findings with an equity lens? Other topics that we've touched on today include the fallout from the Supreme Court decision on post-secondary education, and in general, like diversity among professional scientists in academia and in other settings. So I want to make sure that we have time. Hi, Stephanie. Go ahead. Good to see you.
Hi, Heather. Thanks so much for speaking today. This is a really interesting topic. I work in public health, and we've been talking a lot about tailoring our message for our audiences, whether we're talking urban and rural, policymakers, citizens, people who might already be on board or have an open mind to learning more versus people who might not really be on board and might need the level of readiness tailored for that message. Who would you say is your primary audience that you write for? And do you find yourself tailoring your message depending on who the intended audience is?
Yeah, that's a great question. So before I got laid off 1 year ago tomorrow, so my answer a year ago would be very different to my answer now. So I used to write for the scientists, and that was very much like, this is our audience is academics, and so like, you know, I think our kind of baseline level of education for our presumed reader was a little bit higher, kind of high school. But now freelancing, I mean, it's really like, it's all up in the air. So, you know, I did a story for NPR, and these are just normal lay public, you know, not necessarily science interested at all. Versus I do a lot of writing for Nature and Science, which again is mostly academics. I do a really fun column for Live Science called Life's Little Mysteries, which is basically just like fun science questions where we interview scientists to get the answer. That's like a science interested lay public. You know, so I think I've really kind of enjoyed that process of kind of tailoring to different audiences. It can be challenging, and it's beyond just like an audience. Like every publication has a style, and that's also really hard to remember. I have like a running doc on my computer of like ways that Nature spells all their weird British spelling that I always forget. But I do think, you know, you like, no matter what you're doing, if you're writing or doing data or whatever, like you should definitely be thinking about who your end user is going to be, right? And like what matters to them. You know, for example, you were saying like a policymaker versus a lay public, totally different ways that they are approaching whatever it is that you're putting out, right? And you know, I think you can ask, you know, you can like go to your social network and like figure out what people would want to know. Typically, I think the general journalism is like, people want to hear stories that you would like tell them about at a bar, you know, that kind of thing, like something you would talk about over a beer, which granted, I think if I were to bring some of these very heavy DEI questions to a bar, it would be a real bummer. But yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
Hi, good morning. This is great. I'm really enjoying this conversation today. But what was running through my head is a Pew article I read a few days ago about America's trust in scientists have declined. And as I was reading it, I was feeling this kind of push-pull of like, this is ridiculous, but yet it's also science that says, you know, that went throughout the years that said, you know, African Americans were inferior, and that's, you know, here's the science behind it. So I have a push pull with science myself.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But knowing that science has developed so much, and I think the last administration has really put a bat to science. I'm just curious what you're thinking in terms of the work that you're talking about in DEI, and science and its, and its issues and how they marry together, and kind of where you land on that. So that's kind of what I was thinking about.
Yeah. And I definitely kind of empathize and like very much get behind the fact that like science can be a tool for really like destructive thinking. And that's why I kind of come back to this idea of like everything that you hear, you have to be critical of. And like, again, like where are the biases, right? Like this objectivity is a myth, right? Like science is made by people and people are inherently biased. And I see a comment in the chat here about how DEI potentially is distracting from other pressing issues in the field, like AI I see here. And like, I don't like diversity, equity, inclusion is such a through line in anything that you can think. And that's why I find it interesting, right? Like there's so many ways that you can go about it and it touches so many things. And so, I think a big difference between, for example, like journalism and science communication, which are not quite the same thing, is like, journalism is like holding truth to power, right? And like I've had to like go to Nobel laureates and be like, why were you being sexist when you said this? And like that's been really challenging. But I think, like that's how we kind of build a scientific space that is more equitable, right? Like we have to acknowledge what's been done and like collectively come up with a path to move forward. And sometimes that means like putting really difficult questions to people who don't really want to acknowledge that these things are issues. So yeah, no, I have had some instances in the past, for example, asking Black patients to talk about their experiences with like medical discrimination, right? And like there is such like a painful legacy, and like I almost feel bad to even ask. But like I think that's how we like bring about change, right? Like not through like trauma porn, which is a thing, but like by getting people's authentic experiences and like the really myriad ways that it has impacted their lives and like how we do better. I'm not much of a solutions journalist, which is a particular type of journalism, but I do feel like it ends up coming up a lot in this space. Like who are the people who are doing this work? I hope that answers your question.
Great questions. Another question in the chat: what kind of barriers have you seen when communicating non-Western science or traditional knowledges? Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I'm probably going to have an imperfect answer because like outside of my work here in Moab, there's a nonprofit called Science Moab that kind of highlights science that's happening in our part of the world. And, like it's very much a goal of ours to kind of highlight work by Indigenous scientists. And so I was talking earlier about how you need to come to your conversations kind of armed and knowing, showing that you've done your homework. And so we have like monthly DEI meetings where we like talk about this, and it's like, it's really, really hard. And so, for example, like I've been hearing from a lot of Indigenous people that being really well versed on like the UN Treaty on the Rights of Indigenous People is like a great homework piece. So I'm actually going to sit down and read that this weekend. So in terms of barriers, I would say they're not so much barriers in terms of like actually getting it down and having people hear it. It's like figuring out the language and the nuance to use. One thing I heard recently that was really interesting to me was this idea that we're always talking about integrating, traditional ecological knowledge, which is called tech, with like Western science, as though like they are capable of being braided, but like that's really not what it's about. These are two distinct and equally valid ways of approaching the world, and like that's how we need to put them forth. Not that we're like integrating Indigenous knowledge into our existing frameworks, like it's already been around for tens of thousands of years, and like it needs to be given equal footing. So it's not so much like a acceptance thing, it's like a giving myself the literacy that I need to be able to like convey these things. Yeah, that's a tough one though. That's definitely one that I'm like very much focusing on right now. I'm actually doing a traditional ecological knowledge piece for science right now that I'm going to go field report in 2 weeks. So stay tuned.
We 100% will stay tuned. We'll make sure that gets circulated because that sounds like an extremely valuable piece.
Yeah, I'm very excited about it. I've done very little field reporting since COVID, and I'm very excited to get to go and actually like have some real conversations.
Yeah, I totally hear you on that. Hi, Varun.
Hi there. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. This was very informative. And I had a question regarding censorship you may have come across when it comes to anything DEI related. Um,
Mm.
the reason I asked that is I myself, my background's in animal advocacy and environmental advocacy in a Canadian context. There's a lot of I won't call it outright censorship, but there's certain things that aren't the most welcome when it comes to being talked about in publications, particularly when it comes to animal rights. And I was just wondering, when it comes to anything DEI related, is anything, and do you come across any form of soft censorship where it's like, you can publish this, but it'd be nice if you don't, because you might encounter some hurdles from whomever you're working with, even if it's whether it's peer reviewed traditional Western science or comes from a non-Western kind of lived experience type science?
That's a good one. I've been pretty fortunate, I guess, in that respect. I don't want to say that like we've got it all figured out, but like I will say that publications, at least that I've worked with, which granted, I think we're probably very aligned on our like personal missions, but like publications that I've written for have by and large been very willing to kind of like accommodate uncomfortable opinions or thoughts. The only time I've really had that come up was actually, I was talking about the difference between kind of science communication and journalism, right? When I'm doing science communication, which I do, like I am writing on behalf of a university or a funding agency or whatever it is, but like, I am kind of their mouthpiece, right? And I had one story once, and I won't say the publication, where I was, writing about some sociology work around Indian schools, like residential schools. And my editor was really pushing me to like soften the language. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. Like, I'm not going to pretend that this was like not a bad thing. And, in the end, we kind of reached a compromise. And I feel like I got most of kind of the meat of what I wanted to get across. But that's really the only time I can think about. I've gotten a lot of negative feedback on some of my work. I've been called some really horrible, horrible things, but it doesn't particularly bother me. But yeah, not a lot of feedback, not a lot of pushback from editors. I do think there are some conversations that have to happen around, like I was saying, why we need to kind of take an additional level of like emotional energy with a source. For example, like a lot of times, when I write about Indigenous people, like on the res, they don't have electricity. So like the process is a lot more challenging. And I can't always hit a deadline the way that you would want to. And like, I have to explain like why it's important to take the time. But that's not because people don't want to. I think they just don't know, they're not here. They kind of need to be like walked through it. But
yeah, that's such a good response. First off, Amanda, I'm very sorry, not surprised, but very sorry to hear that you get a lot of unpleasant feedback. And I think that that's extremely important that we do acknowledge that for our journalists, like how important of a role it is that you are willing to do that. And I know that you have coping mechanisms and things like that, but that doesn't take away from the fact that it is, in fact, not fine. So thank you for continuing to be a journalist. And thank you for bringing up the issue of time, because that's another place where trying to get equity into journalism and data science are absolutely connected. The fact that it takes more time to do journalism, to do science communication, to create evidence that actually does center something other than the like dominant Western white male idea that, the whole system is set up to make that as efficient as possible. And so as soon as you want to do something else, they're like, oh, too expensive and too long.
Yeah. And that's one thing we haven't talked about really, is kind of another thing. You were asking like, how do I find people or get people to talk to me? I think like giving people space is a big part of it. And, like parachute science is a thing, right? Where like people are kind of jumping into communities to kind of take what they need. It's like a pretty extractive process. And there's parachute journalism too. And like, I really try not to do that. And so the way that you get around that, right, is like when I have a story come out, I always send it to people. Sometimes if it's sensitive, I will follow up, a few days or a week later and say like, are you feeling okay? Like all these things. And then, I'll try to kind of like keep in touch with people about other projects that they have coming out. And like, that's a balance to, again, not be like extracting things from people. Like I want it to be a mutually beneficial thing. But, I think just approaching it in good faith. I'm trying to find a really funny thing that someone said to me that was mean. Here it is. I use the word diversity in the context of the Cambrian explosion, and I got so many angry emails saying that I was like getting paid by the word for how many times I use diversity. And I was like, it's not even that kind of diversity.
Oh, right.
I put it in the chat.
Right. Oh, wow.
But obviously that person didn't read the articles.
Right. Well, yeah.
But that was
that's a good example. That's a great example, Amanda, of
that was a reason when, anyway, that's
what
just
you're
a little bit of
dealing
shop
with.
talk.
Wow, that's really good. So I think just to continue with this shop talk, thank you for sharing this example with us, which is, again, not surprising, but not happy. We have time for probably one more quick conversation. And I think let's go the shop talk route for that, because there's lots and lots of people here who would like to know how to both kind of build a relationship with a journalist like yourself, as well as how to communicate, like produce evidence that can be used or can attract the attention of a journalist like yourself, or people like, what would as data professionals, what would our next step be?
Yeah. And data is an interesting one, right? Because like up front, like when you hear data, you're like, oh, that's not like sexy. I've been thinking a lot about this because I'm teaching a workshop very much like what you're describing at a conference next year. So like I'm teaching like a science communication workshop for scientists. So I was thinking about making it a standalone course. So maybe we can talk about this another time if people are interested. But I mean, like, I think a lot of times there's like people feel compelled to kind of like sound very smart. And like, you are all already smart, and like what I have to do is kind of like break it down. Right. And so I often waffle on like telling people about my science background, because they'll just kind of slip into like like talking with jargon. And like, I don't want that. Sometimes it helps to kind of build a little rapport for people to feel like I understand what they're talking about. But I think my advice would be like, just have a conversation, right? Like the best part about this job is I get to just like nerd out with scientists, and that's like so much fun. So I think, keep it straightforward. In terms of reaching out to journalists, I mean, I think like if you've got some work coming out that you want to highlight, we call it the elevator pitch, when I pitch a story, it's pretty brief, right? And I think the same would go for anyone wanting to reach out to a journalist. Like, what is the most important like meat of the story, and what's like the broader takeaway from it, right? Like, I think it's kind of like writing a little news pitch. But yeah, I mean, like journalists are just people. We are just the same. We're interested in telling interesting stories. A lot of us who work in the DEI space in particular are, invested in elevating voices that don't get a lot of time in the sun, and we want to kind of correct wrongs that have been done. So I think just approaching it as like a normal interaction. Have I ever presented at the
It's the Association of Science Communicators.
No, but I am on the board of the National Association of Science Writers, so I do know about that. But yeah, I'll look into that. I do want to do a little bit more kind of things like this. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to like answer questions like that. I can put my email here.
Only put your email there if you want people to actually write to you, because this
I don't
crowd
mind.
does write.
Well, I think about this a lot. I used to run the internship program at my old job, and like,
yeah,
I just like, I got so much help when I was starting out. And like, even, I wrote for NPR and we talked about that, but like, that was so much like an editor taking the time to like walk me through a process to like pay it forward. And I'm like very invested in paying it forward to other people, because I feel like, especially right now with jobs being cut so much, like there's such a mindset of scarcity, and like it can start to feel very vicious. But like I really try to approach things from like a mindset of abundance, right? Like we all have a part to play. So yeah, I'm happy to chat more about it.
Well, that's very, very kind of you. And it has been very kind of you to spend this hour with all of us. I can see from the chat, both there's public messages and private messages, that this has been incredibly valuable, very, very useful. There's so many questions that we have, and you did a fabulous a fabulous job of sharing your experiences and wisdom. And I have so many ideas and so many resources. For those of you just joining us or who've been popping in and out, 100%, the resources and the recording will be shared in the Community Data Equity Forum. Same as always, you can look in the events section. And huge thank you to you, Amanda, for spending the time with us. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, and if there are any of my stories that are paywall that people want, again, just send me an email. I also have a story coming out any second about a court case that is starting on Monday. Someone is suing the HHMI, one of the largest funders in the United States, over discrimination against her disability. So stay tuned.
Oh, great. So should we how would we find that when it's almost coming up?
It's gonna be on Nature. It's like any second.
All right.
Sometime today. The case starts on Monday. So
oh wow. Congratulations. Yeah. That's a big get. Good job. Fabulous. And I'll do my best to share the link when it does come out in the resource section of like that'll appear with the video to this talk. So if you're here today and you want to see it, I'll do my best to share the link.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. It was lovely chatting with everybody.
Great to have you. We're going to leave it there. Thank you everybody for attending and being part of the amazing community. We really appreciate you. We are back next Friday with a person who studies rocks and dinosaurs, and he's going to talk to us about how he embeds equity in his work. So a little bit of change of topic, but still got that equity through line. Take really good care of yourselves and each other. Bye everybody.